Welcome to the second episode of the Right Cast. We are back. We are here to discuss sequels. Makes sense, right? This is the sequel in a sense. This is the second edition, the second episode, follow up to the original episode. So I guess this is the perfect time to discuss this. I personally was originally thinking of delving into something a bit more controversial and right out the gate, but Anthony was made a sensible suggestion since we had the list of topics. It was like, hey, we have sequels on the list. Why not discuss that since that's what's up next? So if you watched our first episode, I hope you enjoyed it. Obviously, it was very different for both of us to do. Um, at the time of us recording this right now, the first episode only premiered yesterday. All right. But for you guys, when you see this, it'll be a week after that. So there'll be some time in between. But I actually, now that I've just brought it up, I actually am kind of curious to ask you, Anthony, a bit about how do you feel about the first episode? Did you like it? Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, I thought it turned out better than I expected.
Mm,
Personally, I thought I was going to make some major screw ups
mm-hmm.
and feared that something would catch on fire during the middle of the podcast, but nothing caught on fire, nothing broke, everything worked out great. Yes, this is our companion for today.
Hello.
I'm babysitting my sister's golden doodle. She is the best trained dog in the world. She's been with me for about 2-3 days now, and she hasn't barked once. But she will be
Wow.
joining us for this very special episode about
Hey,
sequels. That's
that
your first
that's
number one trick when you are making a sequel. Add dogs.
I was just about to say, add a pet, add a creature, add something that adds some more fun to the situation, if you call it that. It's funny though. The thing that I thought when I was watching the premiere of it, I was like, this is all right. I think when you first do something, you always kind of anxious about, like you said, like it might not turn out good, and even in the midst of us doing it, you can kind of see. I felt like it was okay, but you really don't know, and then you're watching it back. And I watched it back maybe two, 3 times, and I think it wasn't until it was actually premiering and I kind of watched it that time that I really kind of felt like, yeah, okay, it's solid. I think the first couple of times I watched, I was like, I don't know. And this is how I am with my own videos. Whenever I've made videos, and this is actually just for anyone watching this, something just for you to maybe understand if you ever make content on YouTube or really just anything. A lot of times you might make something and you don't think it's very good, or you think, oh, it's just okay. And don't get me wrong, sometimes you could be right. But there's so many videos I've made on YouTube that I thought were just okay. And I don't like to release things I think is okay. I do try to make things well. But with the amount of time and energy sometimes you put into something, sometimes it's kind of like after you've made it to a certain level, you're like, all right, this is enough for me to upload so that I'm not away from YouTube for like ages, because otherwise I'll never get anything out. But then sometimes you're not entirely satisfied, or you look back at it and you're like, eh. But other people, they'll oftentimes, a lot of times, enjoy it. Of course, the other side can happen where you can think something's great and then it turns out people hate it. And I guess when we discuss sequels, and as we'll get into, things like that can happen. So the very first thing I wanted us to actually cover, just talking about sequels, is what exactly is a sequel, and what exactly is like the main reason people decide to make them. So I guess first we'll just begin with what is a sequel. So I'll give what I think a sequel is, and then Anthony, you can give your definition. So for me, I'd say sequels typically are the continuation or the follow up to the original or first installment of something, whether it was planned out or not. Now, I read something earlier that was quite interesting where I saw a definition of sequels I'd never seen before, which was that a sequel is only when you create something and you didn't have it pre planned. I've never heard of that. Yeah, I know. I've never heard of that. This was if I can find the article, if I can find it, I'll put it up. I'm sure I have it open somewhere, but if I can find it, I'll bring it up in a minute. But basically, it was it's an interesting definition. The rest of the article I thought was pretty solid, but that definition was very interesting because what it basically was saying was that if someone pre-plans out the story, that's not really a sequel, that's more of a series. Whereas a sequel is, let's say you've got Star Wars A New Hope, and even though it was kind of planned, but like, oh, we didn't expect this to blow up and do so big. Now we've got to make a sequel, right? Terminator. Oh, we didn't know it was going to take like this. Alien. We didn't know it was going to take like this. Now let's make a sequel. So that's more or less what they were arguing a sequel is, as opposed to I've sat down. I know I want to make, the first, second, third, fourth, however many. I personally don't agree with that definition, but I just thought I'd throw it out there since I've never seen it before and I thought it was interesting. But for me, it's what most people would think. It's just the follow up or continuation of the original story. So, Anthony, what would you say for you a sequel is? Probably the same, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, I have a very similar definition. Before I get into that, I'd definitely be interested to read that article. I think we'll get into this later, but I found that a lot of sequels where they tend to fail is that they didn't have any planning going into them ahead of time. It feels like most of the sequels that work out the best are because the creator knew from the start what their sequel to their original story was going to be. But to answer the question you asked, yeah, generally a sequel is just a follow up to original work. We're going to go into this in more detail later, but it's really any follow up. So technically, if you make a story that is made after your original story, but in the timeline of the universe takes place before, that's still a sequel. Most people will define it as a prequel. But in terms of the overall mechanics, my strict definition is just a sequel to anything that was made after the original work.
Interesting. Okay, so that is a little different to what I said. Yeah, okay. That's interesting. I actually like that definition, even though it's not the one I would by default jump to. I like that definition just because it basically is, because from the perspective of the creator, of the storyteller, anytime you're making something after the original work, you're making it with the understanding and with the knowledge and skills that you gained from making that original thing. So yeah, even if you were making a prequel, it's still somewhat in response to that original work, right? At least you would think it would be. I think if you completely disregarded it, that's usually what's going to make people upset, unless the original was hated for some reason. But yeah, I'd agree with that. So then I'd ask the question then, just to follow up to that, why do we make sequels? Why do people make sequels? Obviously, we know why studios and publishers, why they might want to have sequels, because, money, right? We get that. We understand that part of it. No one's ignorant to the pragmatic element of it. But is there any, on a more kind of deeper level, for people, why do people want sequels? Like, what is the meaning of them, I could say? And that might be a bit of a deep question. How far you want to go with it, it's up to you. But what would you say is the reason for why people want sequels in the first place?
Again, most of the time it feels like it is the economic reason. The old saying in Hollywood used to be that sequels are productions where you spend twice as much and only half of your audience will return and like it. But in terms of creative perspective, I would say sequels are usually, for the creator, is often trying to strike the same vein of gold again and hoping that you'll get something as successful as your first outing, whatever your creative story is. For others, it is because it was a part of the original plan. Like you look at the Lord of the Rings trilogy, J.R.R. Tolkien planned from the start this entire series, and in his original plan, it was just one story. When he released it as novels, it came out as 3 novels, but in his outline, it was one giant story. Or you look at something like Brandon Sanderson with his Stormlight Archives. That is a 10-book series. That is what he planned from the start. And the first one was very successful and made it possible for him to do all the other ones. But it goes back to, even though they're sequels to the original story, to him is all part of the original plan, all part of the original story. So I would say that that's kind of the main thing. 7, 8 times out of 10, the sequel exists because it was always part of the plan.
What do you think is the reason that people, though, so not so much just the storytellers, creators, but people as well, like when you see people just like, where's the second book, or where's the third, or and they're mad. You've got the common meme with like Valve and about how they don't know the number 3, right? Why does that bother people so much? Like, if you've got a first and the original, and let's say the original is that great, it's so great, and if we can generally understand and accept a lot of times sequels can sometimes ruin a good thing. Why bother? If you know that the original is good, why can't we just hold on to that thing and keep that? Why do we so badly always need a continuation or a follow up, or something additional? Is the original not good enough, or what do you think is the reason for that kind of desire to always have something else?
Yeah. I mean, I think a huge part of it is just seeking that old high, seeking the familiarity, where entertainment, I would argue, really does serve a very similar to purpose to many people as food. And so with food, once you have a favorite restaurant, you tend to go to that favorite restaurant again and again. I'm sure over time, what you get and what you like isn't going to be as good as when you first went there for the first time and figured out, wow, this is an amazing place. But it is at least that same comfortable taste, that same comfortable feeling that you can go back to. It's like for me, for example, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I wasn't that impressed with the new trilogy. I've been hit or miss on the stuff they've been doing for TV, but I've been almost religiously watching and engaging in everything Star Wars because
Yeah.
I am chasing that old high. I am waiting for the thing that'll hit me and be like, oh, that was as fantastic as my first time watching the Star Wars movies.
Yeah, completely agree. So for myself, answering those two questions, that I would say the significance of a sequel is obviously, as you already said, like in terms of financially, we know that companies want to make money. Storytellers themselves want to make money. I mean, that's something sometimes that amongst authors and creative types, sometimes people don't always want to be as upfront about, but the reality of the situation is a lot of times people want to make money. They want to get time, especially if something was made and it did do quite well. It's very likely they're going to want to redo that. In terms of people, again, completely agree. I think that desire to regain that old feeling is definitely there. But that's why I find it very interesting because again, the original still exists. I always have to think about this when whenever I find something like a sequel, or I play a game or something, and I just think there's something about this that isn't doing it for me the same way that the original did. I always try to remind myself the original still exists. But then what happens is there's this part of my brain that says, yeah, but I want something new, but that's like that. And I think sometimes in some cases, the issue is that sometimes what made that thing what it was, I think we underestimate sometimes how much the culture or the mentality, or even I would say more importantly, the place the creator was at the time, how much that affects the outcome on the product that we got. Like you see this a lot with music, where it's so much of a cliche now to say, "Oh, this band's album was their best. The first album was the best," and blah blah blah. And they were more real and raw back then. You even see this with YouTube with creators, like people saying certain content creators or streamers they were better back when they was first started, and they're not so great now. And I think a massive part of why that can happen is oftentimes because I think the hunger that the creator had maybe isn't the same. The things that push them to create these things isn't necessarily there. The pressures aren't necessarily there. So I think that can play into it. When we discuss like what makes certain sequels maybe not as strong, I think that's something we can probably talk about a bit more. But yeah, I would just say people want to see something they felt before, but then also, like you say, like they want they it's like food, as you said. They want to get that same feeling. They want to be filled again, but they want something fresh. I mean, it's like anything. If you go and I don't know, do anything, you have a hobby, right? You can have enjoyment out of, I don't know, cycling or something, and you might enjoy doing that. You might cycle a certain route and you might like cycling that route. But I'm sure at some point it might be interesting if something different happens along that route. Like, maybe not a bad thing, but let's just say there's something more interesting that you haven't seen before. There's a certain house you didn't see before. You're like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know, just something random like that. It's a minor example, but I'm trying to point out how even in the most mundane of things, this kind of first for sequel, I think exists in more things than just movies and books and video games. So um something else I also wanted to ask then. because we were saying that sequels are usually something we make in, in response to the success of the original, or companies, whoever went to make more money, or trying to recapture the fire of the original. What if, though, the original wasn't very good? If the original wasn't very good, at what point then would you say the sequel comes in? Do you make one, or do you just skip it entirely, do something new? But let's just say someone was thinking, I'm going to make a sequel to this thing that didn't do so great. Let's say you really, really loved the story, or you really see the potential in the story, but the original just didn't do it for people.
Yeah, that's a tough one. The first thing is that if your original project sucked, it is a very, very rare occasion that someone is going to give you the opportunity to do it over. And if they do greenlight a sequel and give you the chance to tell the story again, it's almost always going to take a different direction, just be almost universally different style to it. Like, I was just trying to think of, when was the last time that the original bombed and then they decided to still give it a sequel with the hopes that it would turn out better? And the closest thing I could think of was the Suicide Squad, where the original Suicide Squad movie was made by David Ayer after Batman v Superman. It got critically destroyed. And that's a fascinating story for people who want to look it up, where basically what happened is that David Ayer made his movie, and after the reviews for Batman v Superman were lower than DC expected, they hired a trailer company to recut David Ayer's movie, and that just led to a complete disaster. But the movie made, I believe, around $800 million. Something around that ballpark. So it was enough for them to justify giving a sequel. And so what we got was The Suicide Squad by James Gunn. And it had some of the same characters, and it's still set in the same universe, but that's about it. There's almost nothing else connecting the two. So that's kind of my struggle, is that you can try to go to the well again, but if the well's poisoned, most of the time they're just going to dig it up and rebuild it from the ground up.
Yeah, I would say that a good example of something that both of us like is NieR. NieR's original game did not do very well with critics. Like, even though it was, and maybe it is somewhat different to the Suicide Squad thing, in the sense that the original was still somewhat of a cult classic and still somewhat beloved by people. But if we're talking about sales, no. We're talking about critically, not really. There wasn't really anything about the original NieR that gave it anything that would make you think another one was coming, which was why when they, first teased and unveiled they was making another NieR game, first of all, most people didn't even know what that was or why that mattered. But also because the original, because it didn't catch on and didn't do very well, it was so shocking. It was like, what? And then as time went on, and I followed just watching how every trailer, every little reveal, every live stream, how much people were getting into it. I started seeing people who I know didn't know what NieR was, were looking at it. And I saw one name attached to the project that made me think this game, if I'm almost certain, is going to do leaps and bounds better than the original NieR game. And that was Platinum Games. And not because Platinum Games is so amazing and outstanding, because to be honest, at that point with their track record, they've been kind of hit and miss before Automata. But the reason why is because I knew their combat and I knew how well they tend to do gameplay. And if there's one thing that is a saving grace of any of their games, it is that. And I knew that combined with Yoko Taro's mind and storytelling was, I could foresee that would probably be an unbeatable combination, unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Because the issue with Yoko Taro's original stuff and why NieR didn't do so well and whatever, a lot of times is because these are video games, and mechanically, Drakengard, Drakengard 2, oh my gosh, one of the worst sequels. We're talking about bad sequel, oh my god. And then it's just no, but then once you have a combination of those two things, I could just see this is going to be a masterpiece. I couldn't see it any other way, and that was well before it came out. Now, to say something like that about a series most people didn't know about, when I was telling people that, that sounds ridiculous. But there were certain elements that were coming together that made me think, no, this is definitely going to be an amazing, amazing thing. But similar to like what you just said about Suicide Squad, you'll notice with Automata, it doesn't really follow the same characters from the original, set way, way, way later. Now, part of that is just Yoko Taro's style in a way, but I do also think it is somewhat in response to the fact that it's like, look, that original thing didn't quite do as well. And also, without me going into the specifics, it would be somewhat difficult to continue the story from where the original left off in a way that would be, I would guess, as entertaining or satisfying. I think that type of sequel almost certainly wouldn't have, that would, I think that probably would have fallen into the realm of sequels that, because it's kind of unnecessary. So I'm even struggling, even knowing some of the lore between Replicant and Automata. I'm just like, what would the sequel really be about, featuring the same characters, you know? So yeah, but that was just an example I was thinking of where it was kind of like they could have just left that there in you know, there was no real demand for it outside of like maybe like 10 people. You know, there wasn't really.
Can I give you two more examples that are going to be very interesting to see in the future? So this is going to happen now to Thor twice. So you have the original Thor, which was great. You have Thor 2, The Dark World, which was absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
It is my second least favorite Marvel movie of the MCU. So what do? They bring in Taika Waititi. He has to reboot the whole thing, basically, where you have some of the key characters, but everything else has changed in terms of story, in terms of tone, even in terms of genre, where you go from this like medieval fantasy story to this hardcore sci-fi comedy. And then Thor Ragnarok's absolutely fantastic. But then Thor Love and Thunder comes out, and that's going to be a bomb. So if we see another Thor, I guarantee you it's not going to be like the Taika Waititi movies. They're going to have to do a soft reboot for Thor again.
They will almost certainly take it back to how the first Thor movie was. I don't see any other way they're going to do it. What other extreme can you really go to? I think, you know, and that's the thing. It's interesting you bring up Thor, because I feel like for whatever reason, I'm just completely out of alignment with everyone else when it comes to that. I completely agree about the Dark World, but I didn't like Ragnarok. And I think the reason I didn't like Ragnarok is because my impression of Thor has always just been how he was in the first movie. And I don't, you know, I don't like the sort of the uniform nature of the MCU kind of trying to make everything just comedy. And that's not to say Ragnarok was a bad film. Visually, I loved how it looked. I will say this: it was definitely, I think, one of the first MCU films that started to bring some actual color into the MCU, right? But I don't know. I think it was just Thor, and it was and it wasn't bad. It was just, for me, preferably, I would have preferred it was a bit more. And this is why when I saw Love and Thunder, I immediately was like, I'm not interested, because I didn't really care for Ragnarok. And to me, this is Ragnarok on steroids. So I just thought there's no way I'm going to like this film, which was why I was not surprised when people said, oh, it's not that great. But then I'm kind of thinking, well, you know, it's more similar to Ragnarok than it is, say, to Thor, the original Thor. So I kind of expected some people to still like it a lot more. But yeah, it's interesting. I think that goes to show you that too much of anything sometimes, you know, and to me, that was the natural progression. If we're talking about like a sequel to something, if Love and Thunder is like the continuation of that Ragnarok comedic tone, well, they're going to dial it up to 11. And if they dial it up to 11 with that type of antagonist, I haven't even watched it, and I already know, just based on what I heard. With that type of antagonist, you know, and I saw the comments, people like, oh, it's you know, it's gore, it's gonna be like this and that. I was not convinced, and from what I heard, yeah, I was, you know, I wasn't convinced. I haven't watched it, and I have no intention of watching it, you know. So yeah, it's just, it's a shame. But I think we'll see. This is why, like in our last episode, we were saying about what we're looking forward to, and I said Ant-Man. This is actually one of the reasons why, is because I'm curious to see, based on the latest trailer for that movie, it seems like maybe it's not going to be super comedic, which I don't have an issue with comedy. I don't think anyone does, but I think the MCU has been taken in that direction with some films, to the point where it's kind of losing some of the tension and drama, you know, that people want. This is why Infinity War is considered like one of the best MCU films, if not the best MCU film, which to me, again, I'm not surprised by it because I think people tend to want those kinds of stakes and that kind of tragic element to stories once it's built upon certain things. I don't know how to explain that, but let me put it like this. I think it would have been safer to make the original Thor movie a bit more comedic rather than keep going in that direction, if that makes sense. I think it actually makes more sense to start off lighter-hearted and get progressively more serious rather than what they seem to have done the opposite. So and I think that's what you're seeing with potentially, we'll see, but potentially with Ant-Man, where it's like started off quite, it's Ant-Man. That's he's never really been a character that most people have really been at the forefront of their mind when they think about badass or serious. Someone out there who loves Ant-Man's going to get angry with me. I'm sorry, but it's just the truth. Ant-Man's the best MCU. How dare you? I've read all his comics. Yeah, I'm sorry. But yeah, okay. So I guess we're kind of already touching on it. But the next question I did want to kind of ask was, what makes a bad sequel in your mind? So this is just in general. This could be across any mediums, but just in general for stories, what do you think often makes a sequel weak? And then I guess you can follow up with what makes a sequel stronger as well, or good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so going into this podcast, I was trying to think about what are the 3 reasons why sequels are usually worse than the original. And we've already hit several of the reasons. One, it's because the creator didn't have a plan for it. So they didn't have the time, they didn't have the motivation, they didn't have the love that they needed for the project. It's usually just money driven. Another reason we've kind of talked about already is because the newness of it is kind of gone. Like, it isn't as surprising as anymore. It's going back, chasing the old high, and your mind's already starting to get used to it. You're already starting to know what you're expecting. So the other thing that I want to say, and this is my biggest issue when I see most sequels, is that they retread old ground and they undo what was done in the original work. So both of us are writers, both of us are storytellers. So both of us can tell whoever's listening to this that a major aspect of a good story is watching how a particular character or world changes over time. This is something we hit on our first episode a lot, is that this change, this growth is what marks a good story. Mm-hmm. For a sequel to work, they often undo what was done in the first story. Like, I'm going to give an example. Guardians of the Galaxy. I love the first one. I like the second one, but I'm definitely more on the middle of the road meh on it instead of thinking it's great. And the part of it is that it feels like Peter Quill in that movie has slipped ground. He isn't as mature, as capable, as competent as he was at the end of the first one. And so that's what happens in a lot of sequels, is that they realize we need to make a fulfilling story of a character that changes and is better off by the end of the story. But they realize, oh, they're already in too good of a place. So we need to bring them down. We need to give them back old flaws. We need to give them back old problems in order to tell an interesting story. And when you do that, it just makes your sequel drag. It makes you realize, well, why are we doing this? We've already done this before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's an interesting point you'll make there, because about taking a character where they're at their highest point and then kind of bringing them down lower. So is it that what you're saying then is that in a story, if a character kind of reaches a certain point, you'd rather see them continue to grow, and that if they regress in some way, is that something you see as like a negative to a sequel then?
I mean, it's like, it's the famous question, it's the famous answer. It depends. A huge thing when it comes to storytelling is the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is a cycle that's supposed to repeat over and over. You're going to have your highs, you're going to have your lows, you're going to have your great days, you're going to have your bad days. Mm-hmm. I think, for example, video games do this a lot, and they're a great example where something I love is the Metroid series, but it's very famous where the main character, Samus, is this bounty hunter and she picks up a bunch of weapons, a bunch of suit upgrades. She's a super powerful bounty hunter by the end of every game. You can't have her start like that in the next game or else it isn't interesting. So the joke is that she has to trip somehow and then lose all of her powers in the gutter.
Yeah.
I don't mind that in a story where you rob a person of either their happy place, their family, their friends, their powers, something like that. It's the personality changes that bother me in a story. And this is where I compare it to real life, where, for example, let's say that you are a person that has a anger problem.
Mm-hmm.
And you go get counseling, you learn how to meditate, you do the things in life that will help you get over your anger problem over time.
Mm-hmm.
It is very, very rare for just, for example, you have one bad day and then 10, 15 years worth of working on that problem disappears.
Right.
That doesn't happen to a whole lot of people, but that happens a lot in stories where we see this great character growth. They go from being like a nobody, someone who isn't that capable, they become someone that's capable, they become the leader, they become the hero. And then because we need to make a sequel, we have to take that all away. And all of a sudden they're back to their old, bad, useless self.
Yeah. And that's really coming from basically a storyteller's inability to create a conflict with the character at that level. So the initial conflict was mainly around how do we get stronger? We're weak. And that's a lot easier to build conflict around. If you have nothing, well, that's conflict by default. That's difficult by default. So it's easy to sell that as being something that, has to change. And it's easier to create growth from that point onwards. In fact, even in real life, you can kind of see it's quite easy to see the difference in growth between just being even 10 years old to 15, even though it's only 5 years. Now, you contrast that with 30 and 35. I'm not at that age yet, but but when you 30 and 35, I think generally a lot of people would find that it's maybe they don't feel like they always see as much significant shift in how someone is between those years. And there's numerous reasons for why that might be, but I feel like a similar thing happens in stories where people think, well, this character, they've reached a certain level of maturity and a certain level of standing now. It's harder for us to really go anywhere further and make it satisfying. And I think that the thing that you was talking about, to do with removing power or something from someone, is really, I actually think, one of the easiest ways to handle that, and a way that I think some of the things that I consider great sequels tend to do, is put the character in that type of position. So for my side of the anyway to do with a weak sequel, I'd say I think pretty much what you said in terms of the characters not really continuing in some kind of fashion, personality wise. So if we got to a certain point in the character development, they got over certain hurdles about themselves, certain insecurities they had, and it's okay if some of those things still plague them to an extent if they weren't fully resolved. But I think we shouldn't be dealing with quite literally square one again, unless there's a very, very, very good justification for why that's happened. Of course, even if there is a good justification, it's still going to be difficult to sell that as a compelling narrative. Like, let's say you have a character and at the beginning of the sequel, now they have amnesia. So they have to go through, it's like you said, like retreading old ground. It's like I'm getting the same thing again. One thing, and this is just a personal pet peeve of mine, this can be done well. And the worst thing is there's even stories I might do one day which might potentially do this. But one thing I actually typically don't really like is stories that are, or sequels. I don't even think of them as true sequels, but sequels that basically are the same story, and you see this mostly in books, not so much other things, but told from the another perspective. So it's like book one was this character, here's book two, and it's the same story basically, but it's a different character who you didn't get the POV of. And I'm just kind of like, why is this two separate? And and I know they're considered like companion novels or whatever, and I do think they can work. I do think they can be done well, but for me, generally, I think I just don't particularly like that. I'll say it like this: if it was someone who writes fast, then it's not so bad. But I think if you've been waiting a while for something and that's what it is, I don't know. I just feel like waited all this time for me to get basically the same story, because by the end, what progress has really been made? Okay, I've learned some more stuff, but I didn't need a whole sequel. Again, I don't truly think of it as a true sequel. It's just, but it's sold oftentimes or treated oftentimes like it's that. And I find that to be kind of annoying. Again, that's mostly more of a book thing. but it's still something I find jarring. But typically, whenever there's a lack of growth, or whenever you have, I would say, whenever you have like, and maybe again this is personal preference, I don't like it too much when sequels are too far from the original, to the point where again it feels like what was original. This is where NieR will come up again because I love Automata, but as much as I love Automata, when I was waiting for that game to come out, I kept looking at little things, thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is going to be connected to this, and this is going to be this, and da 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 da." And I'm not even just talking about Automata as a sequel to NieR. I'm even talking about it with its connections to Drakengard. You know, something that I spotted straight away. I think there was a trailer that came out at the Tokyo Game Show, and it showed Eve, I think, for the first time, right? And he has the tattoo on his body, and the tattoo he has the Cult of the Watcher symbol, which, if you don't know anything about Drakengard, some people right now they're just like, "What is this guy talking about?" But basically, the point is, in layman's terms, there was a symbol of something that was very significant to another series that's connected to it, and I just thought, "Oh my gosh, what it, like you know." It's a Drakengard reference so explicitly on a character. What does that mean? Play the game, and well, you know. So I was like, that for me was quite disappointing. I'm not gonna lie to you. But for most people who played it who didn't have that reference, that had no significance and didn't matter at all. But I guess I like, for me, as much as I do like that game, I think I'm not someone who's as big into distant sequels or loosely tied sequels. Or, you know, I prefer a sequel that's quite closely related to the predecessor. Because technically those things are still sequels. And like you said with your definition earlier, anything that comes after the original in your mind is a sequel, right? So if I was to go with that definition, then I would say for me specifically, I like the sequels then that are most closely related to what happened before. I don't think that's a necessity for a good sequel. It's just that in my mind, I find it a lot harder to find it to be meaningful, I think, to people when you have a sequel like that. And I think a lot of times when people talk about a sequel being bad, it's because it seemed like it went and strayed too far away from what the original had going for it. You know, so if you like something for a specific reason, if you like the original for a specific reason, you would think you want to see more of that coming in. But this is where it gets kind of paradoxical, because then we're also saying, well, if you tread old ground and you do too much of the same thing, you know, then yeah.
Have you read Mistborn Era 2 yet? Because this is going back to what you're saying, where I've seen a lot of commentary online that, again, like you, there's a ton of people that Mistborn Era 1 was the trilogy of books that got people into reading. That's what made them not only Brandon Sanderson super fans, but just book fans in general. And an issue for a lot of people I've seen is that Mistborn Era 2 is good. It's still Brandon Sanderson writing, so it's still very well told and all that. But because of the distance between Era 1 and Era 2, a lot of people couldn't get into it as much. So I'm wondering if you had that issue, especially going into what you were saying about those distant sequels from each other.
Yeah. No. And the reason why is because that is a sequel series or trilogy, and it is not a, so if the Final Empire was what it is, and then if the next book was Alloy of Law, that would be terrible. I don't think anyone like, I like, you'd be like, what the, like, what? And I'm talking if Final Empire was exactly nothing changed. So that means that, you know, some of the unresolved conflicts or some of the things that were being foreshadowed and being built up to, if those things were still there, and then the next book you got was Alloy of Law, I'd just be thinking, what? That doesn't make any sense, you know. But because I got the fulfillment of what the Final Empire set out to tell me by the end of the trilogy, I don't really care, because it's not what like my particular criticism that is more when you open, and I think this mostly pertains to when there is one installment and then the second installment is the distant one. Again, like NieR, one game, then Automata. If there was like, you know, and I don't mind it so much with NieR. I'm just using it as an example because there was things connected. NieR's an odd example to use because of how the timeline is, but
Right.
it's just hard to, you know, I don't like things that are. I mean, I guess you could say like even more recently, Devil May Cry. Oh, not recently. Sorry, this is actually kind of old. But Devil May Cry, is another video game series. The original game had a certain storyline. Whatever. They go to DMC2, and it's just like Dante's older and he's not talking, and it's like so distant, and it's like, what is this? The gameplay, like, it's just, what is this game? And, you know, and and it's not it is not at all controversial to say DMC2 is regarded as perhaps the worst Devil May Cry game besides the reboot, whatever that
Oh,
was. Yeah,
the DMC is absolute horse crap.
yeah. Well, you know, but it's the things. Some people, I've never fully played it, so I'm
Mhm.
not going to make any commentary really. But some people say it was actually a good game. It's just that unfortunately, because of how it had nothing to do with the original, really, it's just what is that? But I wouldn't really. I'm not even going to use that one because that was so blatantly like some other reboot,
Yep.
spin-off, whatever. I'm talking about something that was blatantly like Devil May Cry 2, you know, and it came out after the original, and it's like, what is this? How is this connected? Where's what the stuff that was in the first game? Where is this gone? Now, another example of a game that didn't do this, but I think um somewhat did this, and this is actually an interesting thing I want to bring up now as a side comment, I guess, to this topic because what we're discussing. I'm thinking right now of Metal Gear Solid 2 in a sense of something I'm now thinking that's an interesting thing to discuss is what happens when you have a sequel, and it is a sequel in a sense, and it is taking place after the original, but you switch protagonists. Because if we look at Metal Gear Solid 2, people were not they were not taken to Raiden at all. They didn't like that. They were not happy about that. There's actually another example I've got in my head. I'm not going to bring up right now that I think acts as somewhat of a counter to this, or I guess you could say that had a somewhat opposite reaction. But for now, with Metal Gear Solid 2, that's the thing I'm thinking of where you had a series of initial game that was very, very popular. People would say it was revolutionary and oh my gosh, you know, and all this stuff. But then Metal Gear Solid 2 comes out, and let's be very clear, Metal Gear Solid 2 is still, it is widely beloved and is considered to be an amazing game. In fact, some people say it's better than the first. But that switch of protagonist at the time, you know, was not something that people took to very well. So just in general, this doesn't have to pertain to specifically Metal Gear, but just in general, what are your thoughts on a series where the sequel switches the main character out? So much so to the point where the original protagonist maybe isn't even around very much, or mostly is just a secondary character now.
I think it I think it's actually a good decision to make if you feel you don't have that much more of a story to tell with your original protagonist. Metal Gear Solid 2, I actually think is probably the most important sequel that any storyteller should ever study. And part of it is that that game was specifically made because Hideo Kojima was trying to think about what makes a good sequel, what are the mechanics of a sequel. And so even if you ignore all the other interesting and weird things about that game, and again, I think everyone needs to play it for a bunch of different reasons, if only because it's predicted the rise of AI. But I think that it was a good decision. And by the end of the game, it makes it clear, yeah, there's not really much of a story to tell with Solid Snake right now. So that's why we're going to move to a new protagonist. And that was one of the weirdest things I was thinking about even this morning is that Metal Gear Solid is basically there's 6 games in the series made by Hideo Kojima that are his main canon Metal Gear Solid games. Of those 6 games, the protagonist of the first one is only the main protagonist in one other game. In fact, his father is a protagonist of more games than he is. But it works out great because that's just what the story needed. Now, he probably could have told the story in a different way. He could have focused on different things. But I would say even by the time he reached the 3rd entry in that series, he just realized he can't be the main character anymore to make the story work. And another example I would give, and this is going back to just like the distant sequel thing, is The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. I would have loved to have been around at the time and find out what readers of The Hobbit thought when The Lord of the Rings came out. because the protagonist of The Hobbit is Bilbo Baggins, and he gets reduced to be a side character in the Fellowship of the Ring, doesn't do anything in the Two Towers, and has a cameo in The Return of the King. That is absurd to think about, that the main character of your first successful book just doesn't do anything in the sequels, basically. But it's what the story called for. And by the Fellowship of the Ring, it became very clear there isn't more of a story we can tell with Bilbo. So instead of regressing, instead of retreading old ground, we have to introduce a new character. And so I think that's what it goes down to. If you feel like you can't do anything more with your main character, you have to make a new main character to make your story work.
Yeah, I think this is actually part of the, I guess you could say, solution to what we were discussing earlier, to do with the characters seemingly being maxed out by the end of the original, or like where do we go with them? And I think that's why sometimes, instead of trying to maybe force the issue, maybe you do just have to switch gears and just make a new character. Obviously, the fear, I guess, on part of some storytellers with that is, like I said, sometimes people don't take well to that new main character. Like I said, with Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2, even still to this day, a lot of people are just like, it's not. I don't like. I think the game that actually kind of made. I could be wrong about this. I could be wrong because I may just not know enough about the series to know what I'm talking about. But I do think Revengeance was like, because that was like a game where it was. I think that kind of made some people feel like, okay, he's not so bad. I don't know, but just based on what I've seen, I've not heard anything really negative towards him as a character across all of Metal Gear. It's more just they didn't want that switch of protagonist. But as you said, sometimes it's necessary. And the thing is, the game is still considered a classic and is widely beloved. But I think mostly because of its story and because of the kind of predictive parts of it, and just how thought-provoking it was for the time, more so than the protagonist.
I can actually speak more on that, and it goes to an overall point you can tell about stories. Raiden was made as a stand-in for Solid Snake. He was a character made to do the same thing and fulfill the same role without being the literal same person. And that was where a lot of the blowback came from. Now, from a story perspective, it actually worked great. And that's what Hideo Kojima was trying to tell with that story. Just because it worked great for that one doesn't mean it works great for many other stories, where if your new character is just the old character, but with a different name, it's not going to turn out well. And so with Metal Gear, even though it worked great for a story, the reason why everyone loves Raiden now is because he got turned into a cyborg ninja in the fourth game.
Yeah.
That's when his reputation turned around. When he stopped being just another spy and became a literal robot ninja.
Yeah, I think as well, and again, this is a really, really, really important aspect to it. Media matters. There is so much things you can get away with video games you cannot get away with in other mediums, because video games have the advantage of having the fact they're a video game, and that if the gameplay is amazing, which Metal Gear is a series, typically people love the gameplay of. I mean, so much so, Metal Gear is literally a series people don't know the story or they don't care. They just play it because they like the gameplay. You could not do that with a book because it completely relies upon its narrative. So, a book doesn't even have the advantage of a soundtrack. So, when it comes to things like emotional moments, you need to really convey that using just your words. You can't rely upon, John Williams to come in and, put on a theme, and you can't expect to have, Anakin's Dark Deeds playing and all the 66. No, sorry, it doesn't work like that. Like, you've got to actually convince people with your words. And I'm playing that out because I think sometimes that is what helps with what might otherwise be the fatal flaw, the nail in the cross for like a book or even a movie. Sometimes TV series and video games, they have a bit more space and they have some added advantages. And I say TV series because they have multiple episodes. So if you say you do something for a TV show, say you do something for a movie, that in the space of a movie, like it wouldn't, you mess up a character and you take something in a certain direction and you annoy people. Like, for example, we were talking about the sequel trilogies and how, last episode, how people didn't really take to those and how we found them disappointing. Now, imagine you got a series like, let's say, The Mandalorian, right? As far as I can tell, people like The Mandalorian. But let's just say if season 1 came out and it got heavily mixed reviews and a lot of people didn't really like it, they would always have season 2 to redeem themselves. Now, yeah, you can say the same about movies, but even within a season, if you don't like the first or second episode, it could always be, oh, episode 3 is really good. Even you was telling me before in the last episode about like Final Fantasy 14, right? And how you were saying that you do have to get through that initial bit before you get to, where it really, really hits for you. And that's the advantage it has in being a longer form story or as an MMO, because there's also the factor of how much these things cost to make and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that medium is important to consider when taking some of these risks. And this is actually one of the reasons why I think for storytellers, like, and for writers in particular, you should really think about what medium you're in and what are the advantages and disadvantages of the actual medium itself when doing some of these things. So if you're making a sequel and it's a book sequel, there are certain things that aren't going to play to your advantage that maybe a movie sequel can rely on, and you have to think about that and kind of, make up for where you can't, take advantage of certain elements. I feel like I don't think I answered the question myself though, did I? About oh, actually no, I was asking you about what you think about that. But yeah, I guess to do with like switching main characters. Yeah, I agree. The counter example I wanted to bring up though, that I was thinking of, and it's not really a counter, but it's just I was thinking about the response to Raiden. And this is a little different because it's not really exactly the same thing. But Kingdom Hearts, in Kingdom Hearts 2, you switch at the beginning of the game to Roxas. Now, for a lot of people, that could have been the Raiden moment, like, oh, what is this? Right? But I think there's, a couple things is that, first of all, it didn't last the whole game. So that's the first thing. That's the most obvious thing. That's the distinction. But a lot of people will argue that even though it didn't last the whole game, it is arguably, to some people, the most powerful part of the game in the whole thing. Like that little prologue solidified Roxas as one of the main favorite characters for people in the whole series, considering there's a lot of characters. And I think that's really interesting, because again, that could have easily on their end have been a big risk. Nomura could have just looked at that and being like, oh, let's start with a new character no one's seen before. I don't know, they're going to like it, especially given the state of how the first game ends. It's kind of a bit risky to then jump into a whole other thing. But I think that's having confidence in knowing where your story goes, right? And knowing that it's not going to last forever. So it's not that big of a deal. But even if it had lasted a little longer, I saw a lot of people who say, oh, I wouldn't have minded playing as Roxas for the whole game. I don't know if that's true. Maybe people were just saying that in retrospect. I don't know if at the time, if that would have been the case, but it's an interesting thing to just think about, because I think, like I said, the difference is one was shorter than the other. So that's another thing to think about. If you do bring in a new character initially, let's say I write a book and then I make a sequel, it's a second book, and then I start off with the first, I don't know how many chapters, 10 chapters or something, or part one, or the first 100 pages or so with another character. I haven't really seen that done very often in books, to be honest. But then again, I may have just not read something like that. But I do think that's you're taking a bit of risk there, and I would think it should make sense. In the case of Kingdom Hearts 2, it was so powerful and so meaningful because of how it tied to the original character, and how that new character's story ties to the original protagonist, and so much so in a way that makes you want to know what happens with that character, so you make people care in a very short period of time. I just think it's one of the best examples of starting off with a different character and then showing how that character can still become a big, mainstay, so much so to the point where people are demanding, this character, we need more. And, so, yeah, that was just another example I thought of that reminds me of Raiden, but it's a little different in terms of the reaction, because there was no Raiden reaction at all to Roxas. There was never, as far as I know anyway, there was never really a time where people like, I hated this guy. Why did they put him at the start? Like, as far as I know, the entire, from the beginning of when that game came out till now, people loved him. So, and again, maybe it's because it was in a smaller dose, maybe, right? If Metal Gear Solid 2 had Raiden at the start like that and then switched, might have been different. But anyway, that was just. Oh, sorry, was you going to say something?
I would say that the biggest difference, and you can switch out your character depending on how much people like them.
Hmm.
And so what I would say is that with Metal Gear Solid 2, Raiden is written on purpose to be a whiny, annoying character because it makes the story better. But that was a huge reason why people didn't like him, because he wasn't cool. He wasn't
Yeah.
the typical action hero like Solid Snake. The Roxas example works great. And again, I think it's a perfect example of doing a switch out your character for someone else, even if it's only for a short while, because of how likable and well written Roxas was. I know a lot of people that if you ask them who's your favorite Kingdom Hearts character, they're going to
Roxas.
say Roxas.
He's way up there as well.
Yep.
Like, it's crazy. Yeah.
And so I think about the Lord of the Rings example. I know a lot of people who prefer Frodo to Bilbo.
Yeah.
If you go to Game of Thrones, they do a pretty big character switch at the end of season 1 and make it clear this character is not the main character of the story. It's going to be other characters. And for the most part, people were okay with that because the other characters were just as well written.
Yeah.
So that's what it goes back to. I can go give counter examples. The newer Mortal Kombat games, I'm not a big Mortal Kombat fan, but I hear people hate the combat kids because they're a bunch of annoying brats.
Okay.
I'm not a big Gears of War fan, but people hate the new Gears of War characters because they're a bunch of brats.
Mm.
You just have to remember that if you're going to switch out your character, you better hope that people like that new character, or else people are immediately going to want the old ones back. That was a big problem with the new Star Wars movies, where I've met a lot of people who like the new characters. They like Rey, they like Finn, but not everyone liked them as much as the old characters. And so that's part of the reason why people didn't like the new trilogy as much. They just didn't like them as much as Luke or Han or Leia.
Reminds me of like Mass Effect Andromeda, because I've been playing Mass Effect recently, and
Yep.
Mass Effect Andromeda, it's like, but it actually makes me wonder: do you think it's really possible if something? Do you think there's a point where something is so culturally significant, it has such significance to people, it was part of their childhood, and it's just so iconic? Do you think sometimes the original can reach such a height of popularity that it's damn near impossible to really improve upon it in a sequel, or if you was to introduce new characters, have those new characters really be beloved in the same way as the originals?
Yeah, I think Star Wars is a prime example. I have actually more issues with the original trilogy than most people in terms of a storytelling and just overall perspective of a movie. But I
Mm-hmm.
think those characters are so iconic that you're never going to make new characters that are as recognized as Luke, Leia, and Han. Indiana Jones, they're never going to replace Indiana Jones with someone else and have it be as iconic and as memorable as the original Harrison Ford Indiana. And I think this is going to be a problem for Marvel going forward. And I think we're already seeing this, where I'm not sure they're ever going to make a character that can replace Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man or Chris Evans' Captain America. They've been trying, but there's just, it's impossible for me to believe at this point that there's going to be a new character that can be as beloved and recognized as those two characters.
And I think a part of, and this is really interesting. Oh man, that is such an interesting thing, because yeah, I mean, it's just it's so odd. And the reason I say this is because, just touching on comic book heroes, you've got a character like Miles Morales, who's actually an example, and I would say one of the few examples of a character that is what that same idea, but a lot of people like. Even like the games that are on PlayStation, like the Spider-Man games, when the new Spider-Man Miles Morales game was coming out, a lot of people were hyped about it. It was very much, and even when it came out, it's mostly been fairly positive. I mean, some people saying the game's too short, overpriced, whatever. But I didn't see much in a way of, oh, I hate Miles Morales. Miles Morales as a character traditionally has always been pretty well regarded. Even the animated films that have come out, the Into the Spider-Verse films and that, like, the new one is coming out. A lot of people are anticipating it. And this is a Spider-Man film, but it's not Peter Parker, right?
Yep.
Whether or not you might put Peter Parker in the film or not, the film is not centered around Peter Parker Spider-Man. It's a completely different Spider-Man. And it's very interesting that does very well with people. But when they kind of try and replicate that same effect with a Captain America or Iron Man, it's not really hitting the same way. And I think it'd be interesting to kind of, if I was them, I'd be really paying attention to why does it work with this. And this is all coming out at the same time. So these Spider-Verse films, it's not like they came out 10 years ago. It's like this new Spider-Verse film is coming out right now. If you go read the comments under the trailer, it's mostly positive. But I guarantee you that I could be wrong, but I'm pretty certain whenever this Ironheart series or whatever they're doing drops a trailer, I guarantee the comments are not going to be as positive towards it as they are towards Miles Morales. I'm certain they won't be, because Ironheart in general in comics has not been received very well, and I think it's gonna be a hard sell. I'm not sure. I actually genuinely am not really sure what the entire specifics are of what the differences are for most people. I haven't really looked into it, but I would imagine it's got something to do with how they're characterized in relation to the original character, you know, to the Peter Parker or the Tony Stark. And yeah, it's interesting. You've got like characters like Robin, who historically have always been well liked and well loved as well. And then, you know, Batman is more beloved and iconic, but Robin is not obviously as iconic as Batman, but he's not far behind him. You know what I mean? He's not that far behind, and I find that I know he's not Batman exactly, but there's often times with storylines where you might kind of take that place and whatever. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, just from my perspective, thinking of it as a writer myself, if I was trying to do something like that, trying to pass on a mantle from one character to a next, or even if a character doesn't outright pass the mantle on and another character just kind of comes along and assumes the mantle onto themselves, you have to do that in a way where that feels meaningful to people. So again, this is another aspect of sequels. You know what I mean? Like, because whether or not you really think of it like that, I think the new Captain America is supposed to be called New World Order or whatever. I mean, I'm pretty certain we're not going to be, given what's happened, we're not following the original Captain America, which means, you know, this is a sequel that follows a new character. And how are you going to do it? Are people going to like it? Well, you know, I really don't. I actually genuinely don't know. I'm actually very interested to see how it plays out, because yeah, I really am not really sure what to make of it, to be honest. I really don't know. But I just think it's interesting to think about from the perspective of a writer, because to be honest, it's not something you see happen a lot that tends to be received very well. And it's just hard. Once characters are so iconic, I don't know. Personally, I'm not sure I would even bother, to be honest. I'm not sure. I feel like sometimes you should just, but I can see the temptation to do it. You know, it's just, I think I'm more of a fan of making something new, or I don't know. I think you just have to do it very, very well. And it's hard to say what exactly makes that be a good decision to an audience. I think it's quite tough. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess that's what I'd have to say about those questions that I was asking. So I guess we've discussed what makes sequels good and bad in a way. I think we could still maybe delve a bit more into what makes a good sequel, because I we've been touching on it, but I think that we could explain exactly what to us makes a sequel like really, really strong. You know, as opposed to, because you could say it's just the inverse of what we said is bad, right? Like, oh, if we said, you know, we want something that continues and follows on. But is there anything specifically that you would think of that maybe we've not mentioned that you think constitutes a good sequel?
I think again it goes back to what you said, where it's just kind of take the opposite of what makes a bad sequel and you usually wind up with something good. I guess the overall sentiment would just be a great sequel is something that recontextualizes and makes reviewing the first original work better. I would say that Empire Strikes Back is one of the greatest sequels of all time.
Ever.
Yep.
Ever.
Part of the reason why it's great is because, hey, it picks up a lot of things that were in the first movie and just naturally carries on with the story. But of course, no one thinks about Empire Strikes Back without thinking about the iconic Darth Vader revelation, Luke, I am your father. And so the reason why that makes that movie so amazing is because all of a sudden you can now go back to the original Star Wars movie and be like, oh, now that I know that Darth Vader is his father, I now understand better why he and Obi-Wan have such beef. I now understand why Luke was sought after by Obi-Wan. You understand so many different things because of what happens to the sequel that it makes you change your perspective on the original. And it's important to note that in George Lucas's original script, that wasn't in there.
Yes.
But it doesn't have to be a part of your plan as long as it's a thoughtful inclusion that, again, makes you go back and able to re-examine everything in the original work in a new light.
So, Arcus, there's so much I want to say about this specific thing, but something that I just have to bring up that relates to what you just said about it not having to be planned. And some people, if you like Kingdom Hearts, you might not like what I'm about to say, but it's the God's honest truth. I am 100%, and this isn't even really just my speculation because Nomura has outright stated this at times, that he usually thinks one game ahead. I think that's somewhat changed recently, but it's very apparent from the first few games in the Kingdom Hearts series, Nomura was not planning that out. And I don't care what anyone says about, we always knew from. No, he didn't. He outright stated he didn't. Just stop. Like, people tell themselves so much stories. No, okay? No. And you can tell, I feel like people who write and tell, you can tell when you look at those that he didn't. But that's actually what makes it, in my mind, actually very impressive. How well sometimes he does tie certain things back from a game that comes out 10 years later to one of the older games, you know. You also get the issues sometimes, though, of having to rely on things like retconning in order to make the story still connect and flow. That's what you sometimes deal with when you're planning out a long, sprawling series with all these interconnected plot lines, but you didn't plan it ahead of time. It's kind of wild to think of where Kingdom Hearts is going right now with Kingdom Hearts 4 if Nomura from the beginning had like, there's no way. It doesn't make sense, you know. But I just point that out just to state that I think a series like that, the sequels are where a lot of the best storytelling elements have come from, as opposed to the original. Like, I think Kingdom Hearts 2 in every way is better than the first Kingdom Hearts game, and that is not an unpopular opinion. It's a bit of a typical opinion. I do think there's some, okay, maybe not in every way. There's certain aspects like the Disney elements that I think Kingdom Hearts 1 did better. But my main point is that I think overall, whether you plan it or not, it's very good if you can leave details in your story that are just about vague enough that you could recontextualize them later on. Like, for example, you use Darth Vader. Darth Vader, it would have been very easy for Lucas to have done or said something where that twist would not make sense. Yep. So, like, if Obi-Wan, when Obi-Wan does mention his father, they thought they were slick. They had to kind of
twist that around a little bit.
Yeah, they had to fix. But there's the funny thing: in the next film, in Jedi, they had to kind of, hey, you told me my father, Darth Vader murdered my father, right? Because it's like, yeah, you did tell him that. So what was that, a retcon? Or, and then Obi-Wan's got some answer for that, right? But that was actually if that was me, that's exactly what I would do, is because you've got to, like, if you do somewhat retcon something, I think it's actually kind of wise to find a way to explain it. You don't have to. I guess you could just try and ignore it, right? Depending on the series, people just let it slide. Kingdom Hearts does it all the time. But I think it is good if you do try and explain why you didn't, why something seems like it had a soft retcon or whatever, because it's pretty obvious to me that was not the direction Darth Vader was originally meant to be going in based on the dialogue in the first film. Same thing with Luke and Leia. Right? Yep. It's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious from the fifth film, from Empire. I say the fifth film. It's pretty obvious from Empire that probably wasn't meant to go in that direction. So, and if it was, all the memes already exist of how, what does that mean? So yeah, but
yeah, you would be crucified trying to pull that kind of retcon nowadays. That I was setting up a relationship. Oh wait, they were family the whole time.
No. You'd have like 1,001 videos pointing out, like, no, it's so yeah. We point out on the podcast now, but it's just funny how, like, yeah, do you have that kind of that planning out thing does matter, and I think it's very important to create in a very tight interwoven narrative. But it's also important to note there are iconic examples of things that didn't do that, and I think you can get away with it when you're taking something that's not too, it's vague enough. The information that precedes it was vague enough that you can get away with that. So with Darth Vader's case, okay, it's just about vague enough, you can get away with the twist. Something else Star Wars related again that I would be remiss if we did not bring up in this episode is, of course, my personal favorite and one of your personal favorite game series, which is Knights of the Republic. Now, I have to bring this up because if we're talking about good sequels and bad sequels, KOTOR, Star Wars Knights of the Republic 2, it gets a pretty mixed bag in terms of how good it is as a sequel. And this is another thing. It's got a few elements that I was kind of talking about where it doesn't follow the same characters. It's not very distant, but it's a number of years after. I think it's about 5 years after the original game. Different characters to an extent and stuff. But for me, it is my favorite Star Wars story. I like it more than the first game, and it is my favorite game of all time. So it's interesting that my favorite game of all time, on an episode where we're talking about good and bad sequels, is a sequel that is typically given, a mixed review. Whereas like something like Empire being one of my favorite Star Wars films is pretty obvious. Most people say that's amazing. Or The Dark Knight being one of my favorite films, obvious. That's considered a widely good sequel. KOTOR 2, on the other hand, not so much. So yeah, I just think it's quite interesting. I wanted to kind of ask, like, what do you think it is with those games? And I know not everyone listening might know what those games are, but in terms of the story that you had in the original game where you're following or you're playing as one type of character, and in the second game it's a more darker philosophical story, what do you think is the reason people don't like the second game as much? And not outside of, because it's unfinished, or do you think that's just the main reason why?
No, I think that's definitely part of it. I was actually preparing for you to ask the different question. Why do you think that people like us love it? But I would say the main reason why people don't love it is mainly because it's like you were saying, it's not a direct sequel to the first game. There are some very important ties to the first game. And we can talk about later why it is such a good sequel in our opinion. But if you took your principal cast of characters from the first game, chop out about 90% of them, and that's who you have left over in the second game. So I think that's the biggest problem. Like, two of your most important companion characters from the first game show up for one scene in the second game. And I know that was a huge sticking point for a lot of people, that they were excited. It's a sequel. It means I get to see my favorite characters again, and it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I remember as a kid playing it, that was something that annoyed me about the game as well. And I lived for any slight reference or anything, the tiniest thing. Oh, I found this, hologram of Koth and he's talking, like, anything like that. It was the biggest deal to me. But I actually think a big part of the reason why a lot of people don't like it as much is because it is not a typical Star Wars story. I think that a lot of people, when I see the criticism for it and when I see what people liked about the first game, they say the first game feels like Star Wars. Now, this is a really interesting thing to discuss. I know we're talking about sequels, but at the end of the day, we're both Star Wars fans, so it's going to come up if we're talking about anything. And sequels is as good a time as any. It's also the argument levied against the sequel trilogy. It's also an argument that has been put against Andor, right? It's an argument that's been used against quite a few things, is that something doesn't feel Star Wars enough. Now, if we step away from it being Star Wars for just a second, I think you could see how that might apply to really any series, because we were saying earlier that a potential flaw and criticism or difficulty or issue with making a sequel is if it feels like it is such a grand departure from the original. But that's why I find it very interesting that in the case of Knights of the Republic 2, which I would agree is quite a departure, not just from the original game, but from the Star Wars formula in general and the overall typical Star Wars feel, I can understand why people wouldn't like that. But I think, and this may be the same for you, that is in massive part why I do like it. And I think that also ties back to why we was both saying with The Last Jedi, we was hoping, I think, to see a bit more of that risk, a bit more something that's like, oh,
Yep.
that isn't usually what you'd expect from Star Wars, right? It's the reason why I like Andor so much in some regards as well. And I think I think I think that departure can work in some cases and not in others. But for me, why it worked for me with Knights of Old Republic 2 is just because I love Star Wars. I really do. But I think since I was little, because I played this game originally as an 8-year-old, I think I have always had a thing about darker stories. And I guess I've always had something about deeper philosophical type of stories. Now, in terms of like the original game, the first Kotor game has, and I'm trying to explain this without spoiling anything. I know the game's kind of old, but still, they're amazing games, so I don't want to ruin them. The original Kotor has a twist in it that is akin to Empire's twist, right? Bit different, but in terms of when people talk about that game, that twist I have noticed is one of the focal points for why they love it so much. And I understand why. But what I would say is because KOTOR 2 doesn't have that kind of moment, doesn't have the Empire moment, it doesn't have the oh my gosh, it doesn't have that. I think when we talk about kind of chasing the same high from the original, people wanted that in the second game. They didn't get it, and so they're kind of like, this game is not as good because they don't really see what was the significance of the story, what was my purpose in this story. And I can't lie to you, as a kid, as a child playing it and going through it, I didn't really fully understand the story either. Not really. I liked the game a lot, but I didn't really understand what my role and purpose was in it. It wasn't until I got a good amount older and I played through it a few times, I started to really, really understand what exactly the significance of the character was in the story, and I just fell in love with it even more. So I think that is actually a massive part of why, with that particular sequel, why it's difficult for some people is because it's delving deeper, it's trying to do a lot more than what the original did, but it's going in a direction that somewhat makes it harder for a lot of other people to connect with it, because the first game had a much more personal I don't even know if I'd say it more personal story, but it was just more easy to follow, I'd say, more
Mhm.
relatable, more digestible for someone who just likes Star Wars, whereas the second game's a bit different to that.
Yeah. I think those are great points to make. The only thing I would add is a couple reasons why I think that the second one is such a great sequel to the first one. First off, you get a real understanding of this is what happened to this universe because of what you did in the first one. One of my reasons why I hate the sequel trilogy is, again, going back to it retreads the original trilogy so much. And it goes, it's trying so hard to be nostalgic that it has to undo a lot of what happens at the end of Return of the Jedi, where the Empire's defeated. But by the time you get to The Force Awakens, it doesn't feel like that much has changed in the universe. And so with Knights of the Old Republic 2, it might only be a few years after the first one, but you really see that, hey, because these characters did this, because you chose to do this, this is why the universe has changed. Some ways for the better, some ways for the worse. And the other thing that I think really makes Knights of the Old Republic 2 such a great sequel is that, again, goes back to recontextualizes the first one. You have a intimate understanding of your main character from the first game because you meet a character by the name of Kreia in the second one. You all of a sudden have a much better understanding of what caused the events of the first game to happen because of the second game.
Mm-hmm.
And so something else that actually does that really well that I would recommend to people is the Mistborn trilogy. I'm It's on my mind right now because I'm reading it for the first time right now. I'm about halfway into the third book, but it impresses me how with each sequel you understand that certain characters that you are made to hate and despise in the first one, you have to think about in a different light.
Yeah. And that's the testament to the fact that Brandon planned that out. I think he actually wrote all three of the books before the first one was even, out. So they were all made, and so he made sure everything was connected to it. And I remember that was actually something that I had learned from listening to him on Writing Excuses in his lectures, where he was talking about how he wanted to make sure that in the third book there were certain things that, like, questions that you had from the first one that answered there, but like we just said, that you're going to look back at certain things. Like, I'm not going to ruin it for you, especially because you haven't finished. But like he said in one of his lectures about how even really, really, I would say really, really early in book one, there's things there that he's like, I want you to think like differently about by the time you reach the end of the trilogy. And you're like, wow, even from the very beginning, this was, foreshadowed or whatever. And that's something specifically I have started doing with my own writing and stuff as well. So yeah, I definitely view it that way, where it's important to, like you said, recontextualize stuff. So when I'm thinking about a good sequel, that is definitely one of the things that I would definitely bring up, is the recontextualization thing, especially because I just love foreshadowing and I love twists like most people, but I really, 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 really do tend to gravitate towards series where I can see that stuff has been thought out. Like, even in series where it's not entirely thought out all the time from the beginning, like Kingdom Hearts, as I said earlier, I think it's still thought out enough to an extent that it just leads to some moments that you're like, wow. And especially because of how certain series like Kingdom Hearts is designed, there's certain twists that happen in Kingdom Hearts that wouldn't really work in anything else. Like when, this character is this character, and how is that possible? And this person is, it's wild how that kind of stuff plays out. Another thing as well that I would just quickly say in terms of what to me makes a very, very good sequel is something where when you look at the original, it's similar to what we were saying about treading about not treading old ground. But basically, I think that you should have it where the characters, when they grow and when you're looking back at how things were, you can see, you're looking at like the character here and you're like, wow, okay, they're at this point, and then at this, by the end they're at this point, and you're kind of thinking, how the heck did this happen? How did it get here? Right now, of course, that's really hard to do without planning anything, but I think the best sequels, what they do is they understand that the growth of the character is perhaps the thing that takes precedent. So I don't want to say it has to be like, if you don't grow the character, then you can't do a sequel, whatever. But I think it's going to be very difficult for you to make it as satisfying if you don't do that. But it ties to the main thing I want to say, which is basically to, I'm trying to think of a way of phrase this without saying it the wrong way. I don't want to say remake the story. No, subvert. That's what it is. Subversion, basically. So a big thing I have with my own stories, and whenever I think of something, and please let me just be very clear again, I've only written one book. I want to always say that, just not because to downplay anything, but because we'll get to this in a minute to do with like writing sequels for ourselves and stuff. But I don't ever want people to think I'm speaking from experience of writing a whole series. I'm not. But just in terms of what I think about and what I've noticed is very good in sequels is when the sequels subvert your expectations of the original. This again links to why I think Knights of the Old Republic 2 is so strong for me. And when we're talking about growth in characters, I actually think this is one area where this can be very well done, is when you've come to learn certain things about the world. And you're talking about Brandon Sanderson, again, without me ruining anything, I think Mistborn is another great example of this. You learn about how the world works, you learn about the characters, you learn about the magic. So you have come to understand there are certain rules here, and that acts as your foundation and your basis for how things work. So that when something doesn't quite go like that, and not just in terms of magic systems, but even a character, if you've been conditioned by the original story to think a character is one way, and then as time goes on, you start seeing, oh, wait, there's this other side to them that was always there, but it wasn't heightened as much. You now have the opportunity to kind of twist the expectations of what people expect, with the story to happen. Again, Darth Vader twist, right? That's not what people expected. The reason why that is so iconic and why it was such a big deal is because it was a subversion of what usually would happen in a story like that. If you've got a hero and a villain, I mean, usually it's just pretty clear cut. You are the villain and I am the hero, and that is as far as this goes. But the fact that it became something that personal and intimate, it completely changes the stakes. Because now it's kind of a question of, well, do we really want, them to fight? And, is that really what you want anymore? Is that how you want this to play out? Because that's kind of sad. It's kind of, it does it have to go that way? Is there not another way? And it also, because with how things go in the third film, it just makes it so much more impactful and meaningful. Again, I do think that relates in part to, without me, again, I'm trying not to spoil Kotor, but I do think that relates in part to why the original game is a lot of people like it sometimes more than the first, is for a similar reason. But yeah, I would say, to me, a very good sequel, typically there will be some subversive elements in it. I just think it's very cool when people think based on the original, oh, this is going to happen, like, I'm just going to make up an example right now. If I had a character who was originally very comedic in the original, and they're in the sequel, you're going to think, oh, this character is just going to be comedic. Now, they may still be that, because to an extent, that's maybe what made you like them. But if I start adding a more serious tone to them, and they're not just comedic anymore, and things start to become a bit more, dire for them, that is something that makes it feel fresh, whilst maybe still still keeping what you liked about the original intact, if that makes sense. Yeah, but that's really the final thing I'd say about what makes a good sequel. So now I guess we can move on to what is our intentions when we make sequels. What do we like about making sequels? And yeah, it's hard for me to really say, because I'm only making one. I'm in the middle of doing it right now. But for you, I guess you've done way more stuff than I have. So yeah, I will let you kind of start with, what do you kind of find is your focus or challenges, or anything you've had to kind of deal with or learn creating sequels?
Right. So I cheat a little bit with this one, where my approach to telling a series story is
Mhm.
that I have to be like Tolkien, or I have to be like Sanderson. I need to have it planned out from the start. If
Yeah.
I start a project, I need to know where it ends. And I've yet to write a book in terms of like my modern releases in the
Mhm.
last couple years, where my sequel is picking up after a story reached its end. Like, I haven't followed up a series yet. Once I'm done with a series, I'm done with it. I just don't come back to it.
Mhm.
But in terms of, like, for example, starting one story and then figuring out how far out I should go, how many sequels I should make for it, my process has always been, I need to write to a point where I feel I have no new stories to write for the characters. And if I were to end it here and I never had to write another story about these characters again, the audience would be satisfied.
Right.
And so I think that's something that the original trilogy actually did really well.
Mhm.
Original trilogy of Star Wars, where by the end of Return of the Jedi, I felt like I knew the characters well enough. I had enough adventures with them that I didn't really need to see them again. And that was a problem with the sequel trilogy. For most of those characters we saw again, we kind of regretted seeing them
Yeah.
again in the sequels.
Yeah. Yeah. Return of the Jedi. I still, every time I watch the endings of that movie, I just think, it's so crazy. I remember watching it over and over on VHS as a kid, and I would just be so sad that there wasn't another film. I'd be like, I just want to know what happens. What happened afterwards? I want to know. Little did I know, if someone had told me at the time there was some books, I maybe I would have read those. I've only just started reading them.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, you're talking about sequels. Those books as sequels, I don't know how well they would have translated to film. I'm going to be honest, but I will say they're a lot more of what we've been talking about here in terms of positive sequels than what the sequel trilogy was. You don't have it beginning where, oh, it's the resistance against the First Order. Wait, why did the resistance? Didn't they already do that? It's like, no, we're the new republic, right? And we're dealing with, in fact, without, I'm reading one of the Thrawn books right now, but not in the original Thrawn trilogy. There was a duology afterwards, the Hand of Thrawn. I'm reading those books right now, and one of the issues they're having in that story is the inverse of what they used to have, where now they've got these Imperial remnants that have barely any ships, but they're like, oh, that's not a problem, we can deal with them. But they're like, wait, our forces are scattered across the galaxy trying to maintain the Republic. And they're like, damn, that's what we dealt with when we was going after the Empire. They didn't have all their forces launched off, because if they did, we would have probably got wiped out. They had to deal with, we don't, like, I think it's Han or one of the characters is saying in the book, they didn't even appreciate how much the Empire's forces were scattered across the galaxy, and that how much that helped them with their goals of taking them down. You know, that's something that's not in the sequel trilogy. Like that just when I read that part in the book, it's just like, wow, like how the tables are turned. That's what it should be in that, you know, that's a logical continuation of where it ended with episode 6. But anyway, in regards to myself with sequels, I would say that it's interesting because this is the second book I've ever written. So it's not just a sequel to the first book, it's also just the second book I've ever written, period. And so with that comes a lot of different things you have to learn about just writing a second book in a series, taking the lessons from the first one and improving upon them. And I will say this, for as long as I can remember, when I've been thinking about this story, this has always been the book I wanted to write out. Like out of the two, this one I'm writing now, the sequel, is the one I've always wanted to get to. I think that the story is going to be a lot more interesting. The development's going to be better. I just think in mostly every aspect it's going to be better than the first book. But the reason why I think that is because a lot of the stuff we've been discussing is always at the forefront of my head. You know, I'm not trying to. I don't want to have the situation of you read a second one, you're like, why did you make this? You know, and because we planned and because it was something I planned out ahead of time, and I always knew I wanted to have this second book, and I knew what the ending would be for it. It's been built towards from the first. I will say this, and this is something that is kind of hard for me to discuss without giving away anything about my own story, but there are certain things I want to do this book that I think is I feel like this is the book where you will really understand like what the series is or is trying to do. And I think that if you was to read it, it would surprise you in a way you might like or not like. So and I say that because I think I'm doing some things with it towards the latter end that's a bit, for a fantasy book especially, a bit out there. I'm trying to, I don't want to give it way too much, but it's just it's hard for me to explain. All I can say is that this conversation and talking about sequels is very important, because for me, being in the midst of making one right now, whilst I do think overall it will be a better story, the ending of it is where I think it'll make or break. And I think that's because you'll either see it as a betrayal of what you've come to know, or you'll understand what I was trying to do and you'll think, okay, I can see where he's going with this. I don't know. It's hard to explain that. But yeah, it's writing a sequel is interesting. I'll say that. For all the reasons I'm saying, I feel like it's hard for me to talk about it without actually having finished it. But given what you said, yes, planning is essential to me. I have to know exactly where it's ending. I don't even know how I would begin writing a sequel without knowing. I don't even know how to begin writing the first book in the series without knowing where it's. I don't even know. I don't know how to do it. Even if I have a short story, I just have to create a mini out. I just can't get away from doing it a lot of the time. So yeah, for me, it's very, very important to know where science is going, because I care too much about that growth, about actually having all the threads link and connect, about having that minor detail. Like you're talking about Mistborn, just a little thing that might have been written about at the beginning, and you don't realize how that was foreshadowing a very major twist later on. You can't achieve those types of things as easily, or really as likely, without planning things out, I'd say. I don't know if that answer was satisfying or not. I hope it was, because it's
I got an
difficult for
interesting
me.
question for you.
Yeah.
So I've been writing enough now that I don't really have a problem with starting a sequel. Again, I've had so many experiences with it that it's just part of the natural writing process. For you, since this is your first time working on the sequel, do you feel that writing the sequel is harder than writing the first one, or is it about the same? Or do they have such different challenges that's hard to compare the two?
I find it somewhat easier, kind of. And that's hard for me to fully actually say that, because I would say this: when I get into it, it's easier. but planning it out and trying to make it work. I would say the middle part is where I'm struggling. That's where I'm at right now. I am struggling more with planning out and plotting out how I want the middle to work. So I said that I know the ending and I know what I want to do. Uh, I kind of knew what I wanted to do at the beginning, but it is the middle part where I'm struggling. I'm struggling with getting from this starting point at the beginning of book two to this end point of book two. And I've been slowly but surely trying to work through that. Compared to the first one, I outlined it like that. It was a lot easier. I think I actually wrote the entire outline in one day. Whilst it changed a lot over the years, it was still easy. I kind of knew because the structure of it, I was going for a more typical structure. It's like, oh, you got a character, hero's journey, you're going to learn about yourself. And I knew that was going to take up the bulk of the middle of the book. With this one, I need to fill the middle with something that is not that, but is still engaging and interesting. And whilst I have some of that, I'm struggling with it a little bit. So it's hard to say. It's easier in some ways. Getting into the voice and the heads of the characters is easy because I established that. So the characters are easier. The dialogue is not so hard. Knowing where I want to take the character development and growth is easier. It's just the actual set pieces and the specifics of it. That's what I'm finding a bit more difficult. Like, I don't know, like just some of the other elements surrounding that stuff is what I'm finding a bit more difficult because I need to make the setting somewhat grow and stuff, and that's not too difficult. It's just trying to tie it together in a way I want for the specific outcome I have in the end. Again, it's hard for me to. I'm being so vague. It's hard for me to explain it, but that's what I'm struggling with really with the sequel is the middle section. That is what I'm finding tough. I did not find the middle section as tough in book one because the middle section of book one was typical, magical school, more kind of stuff I've seen in anime and movies and Harry Potter. So it was easier for me to follow a model. This one is not easy because I'm trying to find a middle section that's satisfying and makes sense. But I don't really have an easy basis to go off of to reach my ending for book two because my ending for book two is so specific. There's not really a model. I don't really have a reference for it. So there's some parts of it I've seen before, but there's certain things I'm doing with the story. I'm just like, oh, that's going to be, I don't know how people are going to respond to that. I'm very interested though, whenever I finally get around to putting it, I'm so curious to see what people will say, but yeah, we might look back at this episode and be like, oh, an example of a bad sequel, the Advent of Shadows, which is the name of the Advent of Shadows. That's a terrible sequel. Don't do that. But yeah, that's something I definitely I've been struggling with. But yeah, if you have any other questions about it, feel free. I mean, I don't know what else to say.
No, I think I was just curious where I don't have a lot of writing buddies, but it has been interesting. Where I would say 2/3 of them say, yeah, the sequel's easier to write, but a third of them do say the sequel's a lot harder than they anticipated. And for them, the issue kind of has been what you've said, where, yeah, all the basic building blocks are there, but it's trying to figure out what to do with those building blocks and make it interesting to make it compelling, especially when they know it's not their only sequel, when they have another work after that's going to wrap the whole thing up.
Yeah. Like, I don't know what it'll be like with the third one, but yeah, it's difficult to really nail it in the middle section, because I want it to be compelling and I want it to feel like it makes sense. And yeah, it's just a bit more difficult. So yeah.
Yeah, for me personally,
no, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, for me personally, the main books I'm releasing this year are part of a dark fantasy series that I invite everyone to read. You're going to find that the middle section of that story is the weakest part. I think the beginning and the final books are the best in the series. I think the second and parts of the third book are still good in my opinion, and I have to claim they're good or else no one's going to read them. But I think there are some obvious issues with it. Issues that I couldn't work out, and issues are also there because it is supposed to be a series that's replicating other fantasy stories, and so it is kind of mocking those problems. But it's interesting where I say that about those books, but right now the one I'm actually writing is a zombie series. And I'm finding so far that for my zombie series, the central middle portion is the most interesting stuff that I've been working on.
What do you think is the
So
reason for that difference, though?
that's what I'm trying to figure out. Uh, I think for this one in particular, it's very obvious in the middle of the series that the key characters you're following right now aren't about to die and are not in any mortal danger at the moment. So
Mhm.
because I don't have to play up the fact that, oh, a zombie might bite one of them or infect one of them, I can focus more on the morality and the world building and the characterization. Whereas with the fantasy series, it is interesting. Where in the middle section, I do have to play up that certain characters can die and certain characters actually do die.
I think that in relation again to that with my own sequels, I think that's what I kind of find is what's making the sequel somewhat easier to write is the
Mhm.
fact that than the first one, and also what I think is just going to make it more enjoyable for people is that there's not so much. I don't have to worry about the origins or kind of establishing things as much with this one. You can more just kind of delve into it and get more into, like you said, the philosophy of things and the structural things and how things really work. And I think some of the interactions that can come from that is where it's going to shine. Whilst there was some of that in the first one, I just don't think you can. It's harder to do it, I think, for me, at least with how I was telling my story with the first one than it is going to be for the sequel. But yeah, I mean, yeah, that's really all I have to say about my own work. And unless you've got anything else you want to say about yours in regards to that,
No, I would just again invite people to read it, and you'll
mhm.
see more what we're talking about. That hey, this is stuff we're great, and this is where even we as writers run into problems with sequels and setting up sequels, despite the fact that we know so much about them and can talk about them for hours on this podcast.
Yeah, I mean the links to everything is to Anthony's website and it's in the description. So obviously, if you want to check all that stuff out, it's there. It's not hard for you to get. You just go down to the description, click the link, you know. But of course, otherwise, we will be plugging our stuff at the end anyway. I would just quickly want to take the conversation in the opposite direction, just for the simple fact of if we're talking about sequels, we have to then consider the inverse, which is prequels, right? Um, what just to quickly kind of discuss that, what would you say is the you know the kind of difference between a prequel and a sequel in your mind? Well, not so much a difference, but what would you say is the difference in how well they tend to be done? Do you think prequels tend to be done better generally or sequels?
I would actually say 8 or 9 times out of 10, prequels actually are done worse than sequels,
Mm,
at least from what I've found. It's just when you do a prequel well, people are going to remember it. And it's going to have a greater impact. If I think about some of my prequels, my favorite prequels of all time, uh, Birth by Sleep is what made me a Kingdom Hearts fan.
yep.
And it works so well as a prequel because even though it takes place in the past, you all of a sudden have a much better idea of not only the games that came before, but all the games that come after. The exact same situation. One of my, I would say my favorite Metal Gear Solid game is Metal Gear Solid 3.
Three. Yeah, I knew.
And it's about the father of the main character of the series. And after you play it, you understand why the world is the way it is, why characters are the way they are, and also why the bad guys are the way they are. And so this repeats a lot what we said in our conversation throughout this podcast episode. But a good prequel has to justify and recontextualize everything that came before it and hopefully set a tone for what comes after.
Yeah.
To give a counterexample, this was a huge problem with Solo, the movie. I actually really like Solo as an individual movie. I think it's a lot of fun. There's a reason why it didn't make a lot of money and why the general Star Wars audience doesn't care about it. It's because it doesn't really do much to redefine any of the other movies. And that's also been a problem with Andor this last year,
Mhm.
where Andor's very well made. They do some great things in Andor. Andor is also about the rise of a rebellion to defeat an empire we already know is going to be destroyed.
Mhm.
And so, as great as Andor is, there was a lot of people that just skipped on Andor because they didn't have a good enough reason to watch a prequel about something they already know the ending of.
Yeah, I'm mostly happy about Andor because how well made it is. All they need to do is just look at how that show's made and just keep doing that, or just maybe not exactly all the time, but just do that. Like, you know, when you do something, because I think it was more the story, like you say, but there will be a storyline, maybe the Acolyte show, I don't know, but there'll be something else that could recontextualize things. If it has that quality Andor came with, I think it will probably be regarded as the best Star Wars show, maybe one of the best things from Star Wars in a long time if they do it well, you know. But yeah, I mean, that was, I just wanted to kind of ask about prequel just because it's the inverse. And for me personally, I'll just quickly say that I think that the same thing, recontextualization, I actually think that what you added on about how it can set things up for the future is actually maybe something that storytellers don't think about prequels as much, maybe, because I think that that's how I like to think of prequels, is in terms of, if you do go and check this thing out, I don't think it should have to be required necessarily to understand the original. But I do think, let's say you've got an original, like what happened in Star Wars, you've got the original trilogy, and then you've got the prequels, and you have the sequels. I think if you skip the prequels, you could technically go from the original straight to the sequels, right? But it's like, it's not going to have the same impact or significance if you don't know what the prequels were doing. So I see it in that type of vein where you should, anything that comes after, even if it's set 100, 200, 300 years after the prequel, you should still feel like that prequel had some significance in the timeline. Otherwise, you get like what you said with Solo. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it then. Final thing I would do to close off is just ask a question towards the audience, which is, what are your favorite sequels? What is it that you think makes a good sequel? And do you agree or disagree with what we said? Because we said a lot. So that's pretty much it. Anthony, if you'd like to share anything that your links to, anything or anything you're working on, anything that people should look out for you on.
Yeah, so the main thing is you can find everything I'm working on my website. It's called Mercenary Night Publishing. You'll be able to find a link in the YouTube description. But for the most part, I'll just be continuing to write books. My goal is usually get at least one new book out every month or two. Besides that, I am obviously going to be here, hopefully every week, if we can make this work. And then I'll also be starting my own channel soon. That'll just kind of delve more into what we've been talking about here, talking more about the art of storytelling and hopefully how some of the best stories out there can make you be a better storyteller.
All right, great. And for me, you can just find me here. No, I'm joking. You can, I have my website, I have my website, nextgennovelist.com. It's being weird at the moment, so it's not working, but that is the website. I'll put it in the description anyway, for when it does work. And other than that, check out my book, which is the Fate Slayer Saga. I have a link to it in the description, but you can search for on Amazon. If you just type in Fate Slayer, it will be the first result, The Light Within Tears. That's it. I don't have a bunch of books for you guys to read, I'm afraid, but you can read that one and enjoy it. And the sequel will come someday. That's pretty much it. Other than that, I'll be here. I have my other channel, Next Gen Novelist, which you can check out. It has theories from Kingdom Hearts, and I'm somewhat semi-active on there. I will make some videos at some point, I promise. But yeah, that's pretty much it from me. So I hope you guys enjoyed the second episode of The Right Cast. Hopefully, it was not a bad sequel. You know, hopefully, hopefully you guys can enjoy it. I think it's going to be interesting what we have to talk about going forward, though.
Yeah, would you like to tease what our off-kilter sequel I would describe it is for next week?
Controversy. That's not what you will see. It will make sense. I promise. It will make sense. But yeah, I think if there's going to be an episode that's going to get some people like, oh, what's this? That might be you said Birth by Sleep got you into Kingdom Hearts. That might be the episode. We'll see. But either way, hopefully you have the stomach for some controversy for next week. But that's it from us. Thank you for listening, guys. Appreciate you. Like, comments. I'm joking, but do that. That's it. That's us. The Right Cast, episode 2, sequels.
Ciao, everyone.
See you later. Bye.